Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. It has been a long weekend for me. If you don't know, which, by the way, I'm really glad to have found out from everybody thus far that I've talked to that you had no idea. There was a youth group overnight Friday into Saturday with our church here. So the fact that you guys had no knowledge of that meant that everybody did a good job cleaning up their disasters. So that's good. Yeah, and then church last night. So it's been a long weekend. I am tired. If I'm incoherent, that's why. So you're welcome for that. We are in Daniel chapter 3. Remember a couple times ago, I was here and I told you, let's all make it easy. Whenever I come back, I'll just keep going through the same book. So we've been working our way through the book of Daniel every time I come visit. And today we are in Daniel chapter 3. That is no different. Now, what we dealt with last time I was here is this crazy dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. He didn't understand what it was. He couldn't remember it. He wanted someone in the kingdom of Babylon.
I want you to hit your head on the boom here.
All right, that'll work. I am mobile when I talk, so that's probably a good idea. But he didn't want anyone to lie to him. He had this concept of this dream that he had that was crazy, that caused Nebuchadnezzar all kinds of issues at night, sleeping and trauma. And he was concerned and overwhelmed by the vividness of this dream. So he asked his wise men to come tell him what it was and what it meant. And no one throughout Babylon could do so, at least of the wise men that Nebuchadnezzar had asked. And so he basically, as you learn about King Nebuchadnezzar, you find out he just says stuff, and then people do whatever he says. And when he acts out of rage and anger, that causes a lot of trouble for people. And in this moment, he didn't get the answer he wanted, and he told his guards to kill all of the wise men. Just get rid of them all. So when a guard came to Daniel's room and told him what was going on, which that's an interesting conversation to have. Someone barges into your room and says, the king says, I have to end you. And Daniel says, what's going on? And he finds out that what's happening is the king had a dream. So Daniel asks for time, and he prays with his friends, and he's able to reveal the dream to King Nebuchadnezzar and give him the interpretation. That's what we went over last time. And it was this dream of this statue that had 4 metals. It had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, an abdomen and thighs of bronze, and legs of iron with feet mixed with the toes mixed of iron and clay. And that's this crazy image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. Daniel breaks open the interpretation of it, which itself could be a whole message, which it was last time. So it's in your history on YouTube. Go look at it. But for the point of today, the issue that Nebuchadnezzar had was that his reign ended. There was another metal that came after him. You know, he was told by Daniel that he's the head of gold, but that a kingdom which is lesser than his kingdom, a kingdom not as great as Babylon, would take over Babylon. And that was what the silver, the chest and arms of silver represented to Daniel in the dream, as he told Nebuchadnezzar what was going on. Well, this rocked Nebuchadnezzar to his core. Daniel saw the future, showed him the future, and he even stated in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar stated that God is the one true God. But chapter 3 is about 16 years later. Time has passed, and as is usually the case, things that affect us deeply, when time passes, that effect also tends to wane. And now Nebuchadnezzar responds in chapter 3. And it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, which a cubit is about 18 inches, so a foot and a half, so about 90 feet. and its breadth 6 cubits, or 9 feet, so about 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So King Nebuchadnezzar makes or forces an image to be made, a gold statue that stands about 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. And then he forces everyone in the kingdom and all the bureaucracy to come and worship at its feet. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. You would think that you'd just say everybody, but instead all the jobs get listed, I guess, for Nebuchadnezzar's pride, to show how much he oversees. And they stood before that image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar set up. This is the interesting thing. Now, where we left off in chapter 2, this dream was that a future kingdom would come, and future kingdoms would come and overtake Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's response is to make a 90-foot tall statue in pure gold, defying God's future. Because the other metals represented other kingdoms that would overtake Babylon. So what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He says, well, I'm the head of gold, so now the whole statue is gold, and this whole kingdom is me, and nothing will ever take me down. What rocked him to his core 16 years ago, that has waned in his memory, but what has swelled is his pride. And so he creates a 90-foot statue that likely is an image of himself, because he was the head of gold, and forces everyone to worship at it and defies the future that God had decided for the nation of Babylon. We'll see how that goes for old Nebi. I don't think it's going to go well. But he has decided that if anyone doesn't follow his decree, he's going to throw him in a furnace. So, again, Nebuchadnezzar, very mild-mannered fellow, who, he seems like a nice guy you'd want to just have a cup of coffee with. So, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. Now, what's been going on in Babylon is Daniel has earned himself a high seat of power in the kingdom through the influence he's had over King Nebuchadnezzar, and because Daniel consistently seems to be right. Well, Daniel's friends also have earned places in the government because of every time they defy Babylon, they show Babylon that they're right, and they earn places because of their wisdom, because they appreciate their wisdom. Well, the other wise men, the other people in the king's court, are getting jealous of them. And you see the attitude that is cropping up in the world again today, just in the language here. They maliciously accused the Jews. The sort of anti-Semitic principle that has existed throughout history, which is cropping and rearing its ugly head in our current time, it is happening back then. God gives his people some protection or wisdom, and the rest of the world does not like it. And they're prejudiced. And they desire their power. So the Chaldeans, they maliciously accused the Jews. They delivered to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship at the image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So their desire really isn't about the power of the king or the glory of the king. They want the position that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego hold, and they try to get them into trouble by saying, which is something that shouldn't come as a shock to Nebuchadnezzar, that these guys don't worship the gods of Babylon, because he has a kind of a close relationship with Daniel. But the fact that they don't worship an image that likely represents King Nebuchadnezzar gets under his skin, because what is Nebuchadnezzar's weakness? His pride. So Nebuchadnezzar's response, as expected, being such a calm man, Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" So, reasonable request here by Nebuchadnezzar. I'm going to play some music. If you don't fall down and worship my image, I'm going to throw you in a furnace. So, corporate life, sometimes not so bad, I guess, because working for Nebuchadnezzar was not great. This is the response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." This is a moment that I particularly think is juicy in the Old Testament. I love it. This TV writer's got nothing on this. You know, this king, with all of his pride that has been stoked and swelling up with him for years since he found out about God's plan that his kingdom would come to an end, he decides to defy every moment of it. And people he has set up in his kingdom to have power, he now comes up against and tells them, "How dare you not do what I tell you to do? You worship this image that I have set up, or you're getting thrown into the fire." And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who, for every reason, should be terrified. Because King Nebuchadnezzar, he doesn't have empty threats. What he says goes. They will be thrown into fire if they don't do what Nebuchadnezzar says. But their response instead is, "God's bigger than you." In fact, God is able to deliver us from the fire. He might not, he's able to. And then they say the thing that really probably got under Nebuchadnezzar's skin. He said, he's able to deliver us from the fire. He will deliver us from you. Meaning they were willing to stand up and go to the death, to stand up for their God. And they knew, because they understood, they had a larger mindset. They were thinking beyond this life and beyond the temporary. They were standing for God ultimately. And so even if they have to go through the fire, they know Nebuchadnezzar has no eternal power over them. So even God is able to deliver us from the fire. He will deliver us from you. And even if he doesn't, we will not worship your image. I love that. Boldness, I think, is something that is sorely missing in modern church culture. Humility also should be a point of contact, but boldness and humility are not separate. They're not trying to take Nebuchadnezzar's job. They're just simply stating the truth. They're humble before the right person. Instead of being humble before Nebuchadnezzar, they're humble before God. And so when the world pits you against God and you have to choose one side of the coin, the choice should always be God. And that's what they're doing. And they're being bold in that respect and humble before God. They don't lash out at Nebuchadnezzar. They don't try to take him down. They just simply tell him, we stand for God. Now, verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. Who saw that coming? And the expression on his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now this is interesting, right? Apparently fire just wasn't good enough for Nebuchadnezzar. It needed to be heated 7 times hotter because he was filled with such rage at anyone defying his orders. Like a petulant child, because he's the king who always gets what he wants, what he says goes. He fires back in rage and his face changes and he stokes the flames even more. Here's the thing. We have, at least as a millennial, I grew up in a culture where we were consistently told that to follow your passion, that passion should be the thing that fuels you. That's not the best advice because it depends on what your passion is. Passion can also get you into a lot of trouble. If you have passion for good things, then it's good advice. If you have passion that gets you into trouble, you should probably throw some water on that fire. Because passion may feel powerful, it might even look powerful, but when it's filled with pride, is really foolish. And when you stand before God, that passion or power that you think you have will be turned into wisdom, which Solomon states, the fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom, and that's what it will turn into. So, verse 20, he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace because the king's order was urgent. And the furnace overheated the flame of the fire and killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the flames were so hot and the rage burning inside Nebuchadnezzar caused so much damage that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the furnace, the guys who threw them into the furnace were consumed by the fire and died. When you lose self-control, and you don't have the fruits of the Spirit, and you have passion that takes you down a road that causes harm, there's collateral damage. These guys just showed up to work. They were not part of Nebuchadnezzar's rage, but collateral damage takes place when you lose self-control. And for these guys, it meant their life. What does it mean when you lose self-control? I think about this all the time because now I have a soon-to-be 3-year-old and a soon-to-be 1-year-old. If I lose self-control, if I have a fit of rage, what are they learning? What collateral damage am I putting on to the next generation that I'm responsible for? Collateral damage takes place when you lose your self-control, and this is exactly what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He lost loyal men because of his own rage. And what's even worse for him is what comes next. Now, these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire. And they are not hurt, and the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. Well, this seems to be, and a lot of scholars would agree, that Jesus shows up here in the Old Testament and is there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, protecting them from the burning fire of Nebuchadnezzar. But what I think is even worse for Nebuchadnezzar here in this moment is he had these three guys tied up and bound, and he stoked the fire of the flames so high he lost loyal men, created collateral damage in his own army. But all it did to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the guys who were standing up for the truth, the guys who were standing for God, all the fire did to them was release their chains. Now this, I think, is a unique lesson in the culture and the world that we live in today, where there's the threat of cancel culture and stopping you if you stand up for the truth and you don't say the right thing at the right time and you don't post the right thing on social media and the world comes up against you. And when you stand against it and you find out that you can still take a breath the next day, the power over which the world and culture thought it had over you is lost. And you're no longer handcuffed by that fear anymore. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tossed into literal fire, and all that fire did was release their ropes. And it made them free. That has to really burn Nebuchadnezzar. Pun intended. Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the fiery furnace, and he declares, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads were not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Whatever that protection is the thing you want at summer bonfires, because you always end up smelling like campfire at the end of it. But Nebuchadnezzar looses them, and did you hear his response? His pride has been swelling up for a long time. And he even built a 90-foot statue to his own pride in defiance of God's message to him through Daniel. And it ultimately culminated in his rage throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, which only freed them. And what did he do? As he continually rails against God, that passion or that rage that filled him and caused him to act like a fool because of his pride, he comes into direct contact with the results of God, and he's humbled. And his response to it is, these are servants of the Most High God. Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 28, answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Now, what got through to Nebuchadnezzar and his pride was someone who didn't try to compromise, who didn't try to avoid the conflict, but actually just said, no, I'm telling you the truth. They didn't seek out the conflict. They were brought before Nebuchadnezzar. But when confronted, they stood for God. And they were willing to stand entirely for their life against him. This is the same kind of boldness that the disciples showed after Jesus' resurrection. It's the reason that the church started, and why we know one of the best evidence of the resurrection is the people who claimed to see it, who claimed to see the risen Christ physically, were tortured and killed for that belief. And none of them recanted. Because you don't die for what you know is untrue. They saw the risen Christ. And so that kind of boldness and faith is what was on display before Nebuchadnezzar, and that helped change his mind. That helped give him not just a confidence in who God is, but a respect for those who follow him. Therefore, Verse 29, I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. So Nebuchadnezzar's come to a realization about who God is, but his life clearly has not been changed yet, because you still see the kind of vitriol in his language where, well, now what I think is right, if you don't do what I think is right, I'm going to tear you limb from limb. But we'll see as as I continue to come back and we get to see Nebuchadnezzar's story play out, how ultimately he is changed and humbled by God. But verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar stands before God and defies him and defies the message that was given to him. The wise men in Nebuchadnezzar's court are jealous against the people who worship the one true God. So Nebuchadnezzar himself is jealous and angry with God, and he defies him. And the people who work for him are trying to defy the people who follow God. At the end of this chapter, what you find out is Nebuchadnezzar's been humbled. He recognizes God as the Most High God. And the people that they were trying to get rid of, who worship the one true God, ended up being exalted. It's like the gospel story all over again. You know, Jesus tells us that we will have trouble in this world, but he also promises us that we will sit and rule and reign with him in the millennial kingdom when he comes back. Jesus tells us that the first will be last and the last will be first. Those who are most prideful will be humbled, and those who are humble will be exalted. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were humbled. The conflict was brought to them. They just stood for God. And they were exalted in the end. And Nebuchadnezzar and the people who worked for him were humbled. So if we've learned anything, I hope that it's be bold and humble. I hope that we've learned that passion is not necessarily itself a virtue. Passion should only be attached to things that are virtues, because passion itself can also get us into a lot of trouble. And if it does, there's collateral damage, and think about the people around you. Let's pray. Father God, thank you. Thank you for the message here in the book of Daniel, and thank you for servants like Daniel, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who give us insight of what it means to live a life that serves you even in a difficult time or a difficult context or situation. Help us to learn from their examples and to be bold like them and to stand for you when it's difficult. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.